Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last event in INTBAU's summer series of talks. I think we've just sneaked over the autumnal equinox yesterday, so this is still pretty close to being a summer series in all senses. But we're delighted to be having this talk on the road to becoming a classical architect today, featuring George Saumarez Smith and Diana Yu, both longtime professional members of INTBAU. To introduce myself briefly, my name is Harriet Wenberg, and I'm Executive Director of INTBAU, and joined today also by my colleague Juliette Butler, who's our Program and Communication Coordinator. And INTBAU was established nearly 20 years ago as a global network dedicated to creating better places to live through traditional building, architecture, and urbanism. So the classical tradition having much to do with that. So be a great deal to hear and to learn from George and Diana today. Just to give a brief overview, we're going to hear from George and from Diana in conversation about their roads to becoming classical architects. And then there's going to be time for question and answer at the end. So just to encourage all of you to type any questions that you might have into the chat box at any point during the session today. And those will then get fed over to George and to Diana to answer towards the end. So without further ado, to introduce our two speakers, George Saumarez Smith first is one of the leading classical architects of his generation, with a career to date including works ranging in scale from new country houses and garden buildings to large housing schemes. George also writes and teaches extensively and is known for producing large-scale drawings, a selection of which formed the basis of the exhibition Measure, Draw, Build, held at the Royal Institute of British Architects in October of 2017. So I hope some of you maybe had the chance to see that. Diana Yu studied architecture at the University of Notre Dame, and joined Adam Architecture in 2013, becoming an associate in 2017. Diana is an active member of INTBAU's Young Practitioners group, a group I would encourage many of you on the event today maybe to look into. And Diana is also a member of the Young Georgians and the Architecture Club. She currently serves as the events coordinator for the Traditional Architecture Group in the UK, as well as the Equity, Diversity and Inclusivity Chair for the American Institute of Architects UK chapter. And in 2018, Diana was awarded the Traditional Architecture Group's Measured Drawing Prize. So two excellent speakers that we will hear from now. And I will hand over now to George, to you to get conversation underway.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Harriet. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I'm hoping it's going to be an interesting conversation between us, and we've got a sort of loose structure planned, but we haven't really rehearsed this in any detail, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But the purpose of the talk really was that Diana and I realized that the paths that we've both taken to where we are today are very different, and yet we've ended up in similar places, and so we thought it might make an interesting conversation to talk about the comparison and contrast between the roads that we've taken, and also to give advice to anyone else who's thinking of embarking on this kind of journey, or anybody who feels that they're halfway along the journey already. So just to start, we're going to assume that most people understand what we mean by classical architecture. If anybody is unsure, I suppose the broadest definition is that by classical we mean it has its roots in antiquity, in ancient Greece and Rome, and is essentially based on different kinds of column, which are the 5 different kinds of column which are known as the orders. And they reach a kind of maturity in Greek and Roman antiquity, and then form really the basis of Western architectural culture, and go through various different phases and revivals. But the interesting thing to us, and one of the things we might talk about later in the talk, is the fact that the orders and classical architecture in general are not really broadly taught in schools of architecture anymore. And so that I think has probably made both of our journeys a bit more interesting. But Diana, do you want to just introduce yourself before I go on too long?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. As you all know, my name is Diana, and I just thought this would be such an interesting conversation to have with you, George. As you said earlier, you know, we find ourselves working in the same place at the same time, but our paths could not be more different. And I think it's important to share that story with everyone, because we all know pursuing classical architecture as a career isn't going to be straightforward. It comes with its specific challenges, mainly because in large part, universities just don't support the study of it, or even kind of prohibiting students from exploring classical design altogether at university. So I'm hoping by the end of this conversation, we can hopefully give you all some confidence and what you can do outside of formal education, just to make you more aware of some of the opportunities and resources that are available for you to access on your own time. All right, so I think we should just dive in, George. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and family life growing up?
Yeah, great. So I think that for me, there are sort of two big influences in my childhood. One is that my dad is a bookseller. And so the whole of my childhood, I was surrounded by books. Too many books, really. Books piled up everywhere. And every family holiday was a kind of to visit a different part of England, to go and stay in a little cottage near a market town somewhere so that my dad could trawl through secondhand bookshops. And I suppose that I could have reacted against that, but in fact, as I'm sitting at home now, I'm surrounded by piles of books too. So I think nothing has changed on that front. So that's on my dad's side, always the sort of presence of literature and books. And then on my mum's side, there was architecture. So my mum's father, my grandfather, was a classical architect called Raymond Erith. And he was very unusual in England after the war in continuing to pursue classical architecture. So he'd been trained at the Architectural Association in the 1920s in a sort of, had a full training in classicism and the orders, and was taught by people who were super knowledgeable. But then almost all of the architectural profession after the war had turned to modernism. And he was one of the very, very few architects who was still designing classical buildings in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s. And his career, in some ways, was quite a lonely career, because although he had a lot of friends who were architects, he didn't really feel that he had that much in common with their outlook on design. And he didn't get maybe the same opportunities that many other architects did. His best known work was to rebuild 10 Downing Street after it was heavily bombed. And as many of you will know, 10 Downing Street is the Prime Minister's house. And it looks like a very ordinary terraced house from the outside, but is in fact very large and extensive building beyond, with very interesting interiors by some of the great names of English architecture, people like Robert Taylor and John Soane. And yeah, so it was an amazing restoration project. And I think one of the things about him was that he was very modest in the way that he approached architecture and wanted Downing Street to feel exactly as it had before before the war. So there's very little of him in it. And I think that sort of humility and a sort of a passion for old buildings was really characterized his whole career. So for me, classical architecture is kind of in the blood. And I was brought up in London in a house that my grandfather had designed. And then I went to school in Winchester, which is a very lovely cathedral city, about an hour from London, that's full of lovely buildings. And so throughout my childhood, I was both in London and in Winchester, lucky to be surrounded by beautiful architecture. So I suppose those are the roots that I come from. But Dana, tell us about your family background and childhood.
Right, so quite a completely different story. I'm from a small suburb outside of Dallas, Texas called Colleyville. And it's the kind of place before lockdown where people would just think you were crazy to be walking on the sidewalk. In fact, people would actually just stop you and kind of with a concerned face ask you if you're okay, because what other reason would you have, unless you were in crisis, to be walking on the pavement or the sidewalk? So it kind of gives you a picture of the suburban, urban environment that I was in. I grew up as a first-generation American to Taiwanese parents, and I think that had a major influence on how I kind of understood my environment. I think naturally because my family, close family and friends, they were not part of that kind of area. So we found ways, I think we were trying to find ways to kind of fit into a community. But of course, we all know suburbs just don't really lend itself to families like mine doing that very easily. Like many suburbs, everything in Colleyville revolves around this kind of 6-lane highway with massive strip malls down either side, vast expanses of parking, and you just see billboards for miles just advertising more fast food than anyone would ever need in their lifetime. In terms of the neighborhoods, they're very poorly defined. There was no sense of arrival. We didn't have like a city center or even like a hub to kind of congregate in. And I think at a young age, I felt very kind of distinctly unsettled in this place growing up. It felt like the story of the place hadn't really yet been defined. One neighborhood would have a complex of 4-bedroom houses that looked like very badly designed French chateaus next to a neighborhood with some sort of pastiche Italian villa next to some sort of faux English arts and crafts neighborhood. So it's quite a confusing place to navigate, even to the untrained eye. So that was really my visual landscape for the first 18 years of my life and how I kind of saw the world and understood my community. And of course, there's always a heavy reliance on cars in suburbs, as you know. And this was particularly a problem for my grandmother. And it's part of my upbringing that I distinctly remember. Just seeing my grandmother be essentially really unhappy because she wasn't able to walk around anymore and run kind of daily errands like she was used to in Taipei. So I think observing that and seeing that she wasn't able to kind of feel part of society left a big impression on me growing up. So I think from a young age, I was just very acutely aware of the impact the urban environment has on kind of our physical and social well-being, particularly its ability to make an individual feel included or excluded. So you can probably sense that my interest in traditional architecture really started as a reaction from my environment growing up. I initially was just drawn to history, whatever it was. Whether it was Texas history, American history, world history. I absolutely loved it. And I think also as a first-generation Taiwanese American in Texas, it's quite confusing to grow up in this environment. You're not quite sure where your place is in the world. So I found a lot of comfort in history and learning about what forces were kind of at play to get us to where we are today. So in particular, as a senior in high school, I eventually took art and architectural history and started to learn about all the major landmarks in the world, like St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, the pyramids of Giza, the ziggurats of Ur, the Parthenon, you name it, and it just kind of blew my suburban mind. I was really enamored by it, and that was really the reason why I chose to study architecture. Even though, like most individuals, you don't really know what you're getting yourself into, I think. Except for maybe you, George. I'm sure you know a lot more about what you were getting into, but I think at the time I didn't really understand what it meant to be an architect, what the career entailed. That actually schools end up teaching its individual kind of school of thought and indoctrinate a particular design ethos, I suppose, depending on where you go. But anyways, I decided to give it a shot. I ended up at the University of Notre Dame by chance, actually, mostly because they'd given me the most financial aid and I knew that they had a very famous marching band. And I remember sitting there kind of on orientation week, and there was a professor that was just welcoming all the parents and the students. And as a joke, he just said, "You do realize this is a classical traditional program, right?" And I remember everyone just laughing. And I was just standing there like, oh, right, let's just give it a shot and see what happens. And found out that it really suited me, actually, just based on where my interests came from.
So it was sort of accidental that you found Notre Dame and that it was such a good fit for you.
Yes, totally by accident. I think that's a really interesting thing about careers. Like, you do plan elements, but some other part is really just based off of luck and chance and just the forces of life. So I think I really lucked out in that aspect. But it has a quite unique, I guess, curriculum. We spend the first 3 years really focusing on hand drawing. So that's plein air sketching. We do perspective watercolors. We draft in 2D, and we learn how to construct 1-point and 2-point perspectives by hand, just from a plan and an elevation. And interestingly, because we didn't make any physical models or kind of CGIs at the time, I felt like I was forced to actually visualize in 3 dimensions internally. So I wasn't relying on software to tell me how it should look. So that, I think, was a really useful skill to have, I think, later on in my career. Another part of our curriculum is obviously very heavily based around architectural history. So we learned a lot about the various kind of phases through time. And then obviously we learn a lot about traditional design principles. So things like hierarchy of space, using light and shadow, to introduce drama. We play with geometry and symmetry to try and understand how to use it to resolve complicated plan forms. And we learn the importance of context and how buildings should interact with the public realm. And just basic stuff, really. Surprisingly, a lot of students don't really learn a lot about the kind of fundamental basics, like how to draw a hip roof and plan, how to cut a section, how to draw stairs. So that is kind of my story in a nutshell.
And as part of the program, you spend a year in Rome.
Yes, we do.
Do you want to just say something briefly about that?
Sure. Rome is our 3rd year, and it's really interesting because before you even go to Rome, most of us will have never actually lived in a traditional place. Most of us will have come from the suburbs. So we're learning off of slides, we're reading books. You don't actually truly understand the meaning of and value of classical architecture until you move to Rome. So Rome is a really kind of important part of the whole education process. And actually, it was the point I realized I needed to have more experience living in a traditional place. So yeah, it was a really wonderful experience. George, would you like to tell us about your education?
Yeah, so again, I think this could be an interesting contrast, because I went to university when I left school, I went traveling for most of the sort of best part of a year to different places, but particularly around Europe, because you can get a railway ticket that enables you to sort of travel quite freely around Europe, and went to a lot of different places in a short space of time, which in hindsight was a bit crazy, but I was drawing and painting the whole time that I was there. Then I went to university in Edinburgh, which, as many of you will know, is a very beautiful city with a lot of very, very amazing classical architecture. I mean, it's one of the great sort of urban set pieces of any European city. And so I sort of assumed that classical architecture, bearing in mind that it had been part of my childhood and my sort of family background and everything, would be part of the curriculum. And so it was quite a shock to discover that not only was classicism not really taught within the design studio, but actually there was a very strong antipathy towards it. And so if I started drawing anything that was even vaguely classical, and I'm not talking about sort of high classical buildings like the ones that I think would be encouraged at Notre Dame. I'm talking about sort of very plain stripped buildings like the kinds that that you might find from the early 20th century in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. Yeah, I mean, my tutors hated it, and even used to sit down with me and say, you need to stop assuming that buildings are symmetrical and you need to draw in a different way. And they really sort of saw it as almost their moral duty to kind of cleanse me of what seemed to them to be a very kind of naive attitude to architecture. So that was quite a difficult process to go through. And I think that, if anything, gave me quite a thick skin going forward to sort of criticism, which, you know, inevitably throughout life, you have to deal with criticism. But it was particularly difficult at university. And I like to think that the situation has changed a bit now, and that people get an easier ride if they're interested in classical architecture. But I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that I still talk to students, and I think you do as well, Diana, about experiences they've had. And I sort of try to understand why that is. I think in my case, it was really down to ignorance of the tutors, that although Edinburgh is full of classical buildings, as a qualified architect, they all felt that classicism is something that they should know about. But actually, they had very little in-depth knowledge. I'm not sure they would have even been able to name the 5 orders, let alone draw them or break them down into their constituent parts, or talk about when it's appropriate to use enrichment, or anything like that. And the most ground that they would concede was that classical architecture is about proportion. So that was their belief, which it really, I suppose, comes from that kind of mid-20th century writing around people like Wittkover and Colin Rowe, the sort of taking classical architecture and abstracting it so that you make it entirely about proportion. And certainly when I was...
Sorry,
yeah,
I was just going to ask, coming from your background, you know, given that your grandfather was who he was that not just like life-shattering almost? To go into a university, very excited to kind of embark on this, the start of your kind of architectural journey, and have to suddenly be prevented from doing why you came into this, you know, in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could liken it to somebody who loves classical music and goes to study music and is told that they're not allowed to play the violin. You know, it's kind of, it's a little crazy. But somehow architecture, it's sort of like different rules seem to apply. And even amongst my friends, it used to be a sort of joke of like, how good a project can George get? And how good a project can he do, and how bad a mark can he get for it? Because it was sort of like I was being treated totally differently. And it was quite odd to me, but it was also odd to my fellow students. And I think that this sort of process of I mean, you could think of it almost like brainwashing, that anybody who's interested in traditional architecture gets it quickly wrung out of them. So anyway, that was my experience. And also when I was at university, it was still, I mean, we're talking about the mid-90s. So it was a time when computers hadn't really sort of, they were around, but still most things were done by hand. So actually a lot of good things happened at university. It was not at all about skills or technique. In fact, the fact that I practiced drawing a lot was almost seen like a kind of conjuring trick, that a sort of sleight of hand, that, you know, if you're good at drawing, that's kind of an unfair advantage. And so actually you get, it almost places you at a disadvantage when it comes to tutors.
So you obviously got that over and done with. And then I think you were able to kind of move on to, was it Quinlan's office that you worked at first?
So then
Yeah.
my grandfather had been, late in his career, had been in partnership with a young architect called Quinlan Terry, who then, after my grandfather's death in the early 70s, had gone on to have a very successful career as a prominent classical architect. And so when I left university, I went to work for him for about 5 years. And that was, again, a big contrast to university, because I was in a place where there were no questions asked about whether it was classical or not. And it was like a kind of full immersion in traditional building, which was a great training for me. And most of the first year that I spent there was at a big drawing board, standing up all day just drawing sash windows. That's you know, I spent almost a whole year just drawing full-size details of sash windows. So now if I need to draw details of sash window, I can do them sort of blindfolded, or, you know, a really, really good training, but one that it would be very difficult for somebody to get now, because everything is done on computer, and the thing about drawing by hand is it's only one remove from actually making it. It's much more physical than building things on a screen. So I think the fact that you had a university education drawing by hand was maybe quite unusual at the time as well.
Very unusual. I remember talking to peers who didn't go to Notre Dame, and they were quite flabbergasted that we'd never touched, you know, computer software until year 4. But actually, in hindsight, it couldn't have been a more useful skill to have learned at university. Learning how to kind of sketch with ease and put your design ideas onto paper quickly for your clients to see. How to express your ideas also without having to verbalize it. I think, you know, a picture is 1,000 words. So
yes.
It was such a useful skill to have.
But
it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so my sort of first office experience was pretty intense, and it was frustrating in some ways, because as a young architect, I spent an awful lot of time drawing, didn't spend very much time with clients or going to building sites, and I realise now in an office that the junior people do often feel those frustrations, and it's important to try and understand those, But drawing, at the time, it seems like you're doing all the work and everybody else is swanning off, kind of seeing clients and doing fun things. But that process is an unbelievably useful part of the training, I think. But tell us about your first office experience.
Well, so I ended up first working at Adam Architecture. It's worked out okay, I think, because I'm still there. I kind of had something in mind for what it was going to be like to work there, but it's been kind of way more than what I expected. One kind of unsettling part of studying at Notre Dame is what I kind of mentioned earlier. You just don't actually experience what it's like to live in a traditional place. You can only kind of read from books and try and picture it and kind of really rely on your experience in Rome for a year, but that's hardly kind of a typical and normal experience to have. It's not like you can replicate Rome in your designs. So I wanted something a little bit more reasonable. It was just so wonderful to live in a space where everything you need is in a 10-minute walking radius. Work-wise, I absolutely loved that we were encouraged to just go out and look at things and find precedent. You know, previously finding precedent for me was going to the library, which is great, but even better when it's like right in front of you. You can really see all the junctions and see how tricky areas are resolved. I had quite a canonical background, so I learned a lot about, you know, the rules of proportion for each of the 5 quarters, how it relates to the diameter. And I realized in the real world, it's you know, loosely applied. And I remember having an argument with one of our managers. He was just asking me to adjust the frieze ever so often, or ever so slightly, and I was in shock. Like, you can't adjust the frieze. You have to keep to the proportions. Yeah. But then I soon realized that there's a lot more to design than just the proportions. You know, often you have to follow the coursing of the bricks or the blockwork behind. I started learning about the local materials, which you didn't necessarily learn at uni. I was also pleased to see that a lot of people still draw in our office, which is really wonderful.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most meaningful aspects for me practicing in England is I just feel like the application of traditional and classical architecture in new builds is far more kind of culturally ingrained. It's something that people really appreciate, whereas I feel like back in Texas, housing can be felt as something that's like a commodity, something you can just build and then destroy. Here, there's just definitely just fundamentally more meaning behind it all. So I've really enjoyed that. It's also really wonderful that we do a wide range of work. So we do speculative housing, kind of regeneration work in the city, and country houses. So it's nice to apply your kind of knowledge and skills into multiple different types of projects.
And that's, I mean, going back to what you were saying about how your grandmother had felt quite excluded, and that's this whole sort of question around traditional urbanism and it's the role that it can play in shaping communities. You and I, Dan, have worked together for quite a few years now on Poundbury, and so we've been able to actually, I think, make a difference to future the community that will eventually move into the areas that we've been designing. Does that feel like it's been particularly meaningful, given what you were saying earlier about your childhood?
Oh, yes, it's been probably the most fulfilling part, I think, of my experience at the office. It's nice to kind of be a part of it because I don't really see much of it happening elsewhere in terms of just providing some sort of mixed-use design development where there's a lot of accessibility. You can walk, you can cycle. It's attention to much more than just the numbers on a plot and maximizing profit. So it's been really satisfying in that sense. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and then another thing I was just going to say, because we must take some questions in a moment, but yes. Another thing that you and I have both been involved in, I as a teacher and you as a student, has been the Engelsberg Summer School, which is of course an INTBAU thing. And I think that some of the alumni of the Engelsberg Summer School are maybe in the audience this evening. So it would be maybe good to talk about that. And for anybody who doesn't know, about 5 or 6 years ago, an opportunity came up to partner between INTBAU and the Axon Johnson Foundation in Sweden, who have an amazing site north of Stockholm, which used to be an industrial site in the 18th and 19th century, making steel. And they had this whole site of redundant buildings in quite an isolated site, surrounded by beautiful countryside. And they wanted to restore the buildings, but find a use for them. And they had realized that it would make a very good place for residential courses and as a place of teaching. So essentially it was taking an area that had been a kind of industrial hub and turn it into an educational one. And so then we ran the first Engelsberg Summer School, I think 5 or 6 years ago, and that went very well. There were a group of tutors from different parts of the world, and Jenny Bevan and Christopher Liberatus were the sort of key people who were there throughout the whole course, and they're practicing architects in Charleston in South Carolina. But they very courageously sort of made the jump to Sweden for a month to run the program, and they've been doing so ever since. So for me, it's been an amazing program to sort of teach classical architecture to a new generation, but do it in a more broad-minded way than perhaps other schools have done previously. But Dana, what's your experience been like?
Yeah, so I was probably the third group that went in, and I think I speak for everyone who's been in the course before, but it's just such a immersive, fantastic experience where it's quite interesting because most of the tutors are actually practitioners. So you get kind of a diverse range of perspectives, and you get to see their kind of built work today. So it's not just learning about the history, it's also seeing the application of it today in different parts of the world. And after this kind of crash course in classical architecture for a month, you really feel like you've made really good relationships, and they essentially become your kind of support network after you leave. So it's a really good way to kind of get into the network if you're interested in pursuing classical architecture, but you don't really have the means to study it at university. I'd highly recommend going. And they do offer scholarships or bursaries. So if finances are a concern for you, that's definitely something you can look into. So yeah, that's Englesberg.
Yeah.
I just thought maybe we should go through.
Should we take some questions? Yeah.
So there's several questions that are kind of similar. This one's from Vincent. What kind of study advice would you give to someone who wants to self-study classical architecture, starting from zero, and isn't physically able to attend lectures or summer schools? What would your advice be?
I mean, you know, books, of course, I will say that books are a good start. And I've got far too many books. But I think when I was a student, there were two particular books that I loved, which were sort of setting out. And actually, I've got them here so I can hold them up. One is the John Summerson, Classical Language of Architecture, which I think it was written as a series of radio lectures that Summerson gave in the 1970s. And they're very sort of easy to read, very conversational. And I really recommend that for somebody who's completely new to classical architecture. Those are great. The other book that I read as a student was Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture by Robert Venturi, which is, I mean, it's really a sort of postmodernist manifesto. But I'm not so keen on Robert Venturi's buildings, but it is. It's a very, very wide-ranging, brilliantly written survey of sort of architecture from antiquity to the present day, and the way that he's able to kind of choose things from completely different time and place and compare them together. I really enjoyed that as a student, so I'd recommend those two books. The other thing that I started doing when I was at university, because it soon became clear that I just wouldn't be able to design classical buildings. My tutors would have just had me thrown out. So I started doing measure drawings of classical buildings. And so I've now got about 20 sketchbooks full of measure drawings. And for me, that's been a really useful way of understanding construction, proportion, detail, materials, because if you sketch something just sitting on a stool, drawing it remotely, you don't really engage with it. Whereas to do a measure drawing, and I think you've done, well, you have done some measure drawing, won prizes for it there.
Just one.
You know that it is a much more physical thing. You know, you actually have to clamber all over the building and understand how it's put together in order to make a measure drawing of it. So I would definitely recommend that. Read lots of books and draw classical buildings, but particularly measure drawings.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just also add, maybe even going a step further and reaching out to your local craftsmen and women. I think if you're interested in traditional classical architecture, you have to understand that it's very kind of, building methods differ by geography, and it's so useful to kind of go to the workshops and see how they build and design things in your particular area. Particularly if you don't have a formal education which will allow you to kind of learn some of the basics. It's kind of useful just to go out and observe, I think. Something that I used to do actually, if people are particularly keen and don't have the opportunity to design classically, just kind of want to get into it, is just give yourself, design projects. Find a site that you think is particularly vile and provide a new design solution for it. Do what you would do at university, analyze the site, look at the context, how does the public interface with it, what are the problems, and what can you make, what can you propose that would make it better. And then kind of one last thing I'd also add is just take advantage of the fact that we are all virtually based right now, and that there are a lot of organizations that are now running things on Zoom as we are today, and things like events from the Georgian group, TAG, the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings. They're all hosting series of events online, so tap into that network, definitely.
Yeah, that's great advice, I think.
Yeah, and of course, sorry, and also the ICAA, of course, if you're based in the US. Yeah. Okay, let's get another question here. Let's see. One question is, what is something kind of companies look for, classical architecture companies look for, and a potential hiree?
So yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, it is quite difficult in the UK because really talented students do tend to get put off classical or traditional architecture by their schools of by the architecture schools. So which is not that helpful for those of us who are practicing it, because students think that that's not an option for them. But I think actually, fortunately, the world has kind of changed, and there's so much social media now, and anybody who's interested in classical architecture can reach out and find firms. I would say that drawing ability, as we were saying earlier, Diana, an interest in buildings. I mean, this is what I found about architecture school. It's not really about buildings at all. It's like, this is sort of just about philosophy. It's more like a fine art degree, I think. But you've got to be interested in buildings, like staircases, joinery, stonework, like, sort of, I think you either know, or you know whether you're interested in that or not, because it's something that is a natural passion. So also what I've increasingly realized over the years is that we think that architecture is about buildings, but it's just as much about people. And so understanding psychology of how people work, and also being a good communicator, being able to get on with other people in the office. So I think it's those things really, sort of drawing ability, interest in buildings, but also an ability to get on with people. And then I think if people want to further their careers, then there are things like having financial awareness, or making sure that you're really well organized, which obviously make a big difference once you've started your career properly. Yeah.
Okay, great. I've got another one here from Goran, who asks, is there a job board for classical architects in Europe? And how did I get my job? So the answer is no, there isn't a job board, but the network is so small. If you talk to anyone who's already in the network, they could probably list off all the companies, kind of relevant companies in this niche that we're in. For me, how did I get this job? I think, again, because the network is so tight knit, everyone kind of knows each other. I believe I got this job, well, mainly because I reached out first, and then I think one of the directors of our office just knew one of my professors, and so I think they had a conversation about me, and it was quite positive from what I gather. So that's how I ended up in the position.
And actually, what's good, Diana, is after you joined, you've then been able to recommend some other people from Notre Dame who've joined us since as well. Yeah. So as you say, it is quite a small world.
Yeah. There's one question from Benjamin. He asked, how good do the admission artworks have to be granted entry to a university? For example, University of Notre Dame. Well, interesting, because Notre Dame doesn't actually have an application process where you actually have to put in a portfolio. If you are accepted into Notre Dame, you're accepted to the entire university. So we didn't have to particularly kind of apply just for the architecture department, if that makes sense. So I didn't have to do the portfolio, but I think for most universities that's the case. Did you have to put in a portfolio?
Yes, I did. I did, and it was it was full of drawings of buildings. I mean, it was. I drew a lot when I was at school, more than doing academic study. I just loved drawing. Yeah. But I think that was maybe not typical. A lot of people came, with a portfolio full of more abstract work, or they've drawn portraits and things like that. I think it was unusual to have a portfolio full of buildings.
Yeah. Someone asked, Flavio asks, is there such thing as a traditional or classical urban planner? Can you be a traditional planner without being an architect? Do you have an immediate thought on that?
It's a good question. I mean, we do a lot of urban design, and our work at Poundbury actually is really filling out the master plan that Leon Krier drew 20 plus years ago. And Leon Krier is still very involved, and the drawings that we do, Diana, as you know, go to him for comments. So, I mean, although we're involved in Poundbury, it's not in a master planning role. But when we do master planning, actually, what we look at is local character, and it tends to be more on the vernacular spectrum. I would say that what is classical urban design? It's probably, those are sort of very grand planning. And actually, I went up to Edinburgh last week and took a tram from Edinburgh Airport to the city centre. And over the last 20 years, they've built sort of these huge business parks and education campuses and industrial sheds everywhere. And I mean, that actually is classical planning. But if you look at it from above, it's just a completely kind of symmetrical grid. And we don't do that kind of planning at all. We're much more interested in the sort of fine grain that makes traditional places. So I would say that we're not really classical urban designers at all. We're much more vernacular placemaking, looking at local, what makes places locally distinctive.
Yes, I don't think there is a straightforward path, I suppose, academically, if you want to pursue classical urban design, but I guess the closest thing to it might be the Congress of New Urbanism, which is this organization in the US who kind of promote these traditional design values in urban planning. So do have a look at their webpage. You can Google them, CNU. I have lots of information on how you can kind of get involved, and maybe some resources as well that you can tap into.
Yeah.
We have another question from Fatima, who asks, what was your final project at the University of Edinburgh, George?
I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't, because it will bore everybody. But in a nutshell, it was in Venice. We were allowed to choose our own site and our own brief. There was no budget, no, you could do whatever you like. And I chose a site on the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, which is quite a small island. It's got a church on it by Palladio, and a couple of very beautiful cloisters behind, one of which is by Longhena, who's a Baroque architect. And then there's a monastery that is around the back of the church. And I did a project which, the church owns a copy of a very rare architectural treatise that was published in 1499 that's called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily. and I decided that that my project was going to be a library just to house that one book. And so the project basically involved an oak casket lined in lead into which the book would fit, and then it would be lowered into a trench dug into the soil at the back of the island and filled with tar. And my teachers absolutely loved it. And but meanwhile, when I was in Venice, I was doing measure drawings of all of the base moldings of the
I'm sure.
stuff. Yeah, so I kind of got away with it, but it was yeah, I was definitely playing along with the system.
There's a really interesting question here from Emerald. Is there a developed collaboration between classical architects, sculptors, and artists? Oh, absolutely. It's almost essential, isn't it, to successful building? And I would add landscape architects to that as well.
Yeah, and interiors, yeah. And
interiors, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's good. I mean, it's one of the great joys actually for us is you know, when the budget allows, is being able to collaborate with sculptors. And some of the best projects, certainly I feel some of my most successful projects have been ones where we've been able to incorporate sculpture and collaborate. Yeah, it's one of the great things about classical architecture. It's like a sort of volume dial that you can turn up and down. But when you turn the volume up quite high, the possibilities for sculpture and enrichment and yeah, I mean, they're almost endless.
Okay, maybe we have time for a few more. Mike is asking if there are any practicing classical architects in Canada. Seems like a rare breed. I don't think we're aware of any particular classical architects in Canada, but you could branch out more broadly into the kind of traditional architecture world. I believe we have a Canada chapter in INTBAU, is that right? Harriet and Jules?
Yes, that is right.
Yeah. Yes. Harriet's actually in Canada as we speak, so she's representing. Certainly it's something that I think you'll have to just dig in a little bit more. I'm sure they're out there, but it's just less obvious. Yeah. One last one. How do you see classical architecture merging with future technologies to create a new approach which transcends its individual components?
So, well, this is an interesting one about sort of the extent to which classical architecture is linked to building tectonics. And, you know, often I used to find at universities, people say, you can't do classical architecture now because it can't be built the way that it used to be built. And I've learnt really the answer to that is, which period are you thinking about? Is it 5th century BC in Athens, or are you talking about like Roman construction of the dome of the Pantheon, or are you talking about how New York classical banks were built in the 1920s? It's like, and I think the really interesting thing about classical architecture is that people do connect it with a particular kind of solid construction, but it's never been that way. You do find solid buildings, but you also find ones which are temporary or sort of sandwich construction or frame. And so, and I think that in our office, Dan, we're very, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about construction, but ultimately new classical buildings have to meet modern standards, and I think that it will continue to evolve along those lines.
And even today, you know, designing classical buildings, they're built in completely different ways in contemporary design. So like in Texas, where I'm from, a lot of the classical houses are still very much timber frame. Here we use load-bearing masonry. I think we also did a project in Delhi, and that was all steel frame clad. Yeah, that one right there.
Well, this one was entirely load-bearing masonry.
There was another one.
But we did another one, which was steel frame, yeah.
A very kind of thin veneer applied. So it varies widely. It depends on kind of, I guess, you know, access to supply chain, building regulations,
Budget.
budget, a large part, but yeah, is budget.
Yeah.
So yes, I think that answered that question. Let's see if there's another one. It seems that the municipalities in Finland are in charge of granting building permits, that are in charge of granting building permits don't allow to build in classical architectural style. Do you have similar problems elsewhere? Oh.
Yeah,
Yes,
so this is a sort of
absolutely.
Venice Charter thing about how new alterations to buildings should be clearly distinct from the old building and so on. That still persists in large parts of Europe, I think. And yeah, we need, yeah, it's, I mean, actually, in some ways, I agree with some of the sentiment that it can be a good idea for new parts to be clearly distinct, but then there are cases also where you want something to be entirely seamless. It's really a question of appropriateness, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting here too, where I see so many wonderful examples of classical architecture and having to go to the planning appeal process and argue why you should be designing traditionally, and hearing the arguments among conservationists is really complicated. This belief that it should be of our time, that sentiment kind of continues as an argument against classical architecture. Yeah, that's quite interesting to observe in reality. Okay, I think I'll wrap up with one last question, George. Why does the world need classical architecture?
Well, I would say, I haven't prepared an answer to this, Dan, but it's quite a big question.
Putting on spot.
I would say there are two big challenges that the world is facing at the moment. One is how we can somehow create a society where people are more tolerant of religious, ethnic, social difference. Because I think that we are we seem to be living in a time where we're all talking about greater tolerance, but actually in many parts of the world there seems to be less and less. So I think that a more tolerant society, and the other major challenge is environmental, is how we can somehow exist in balance with nature. And actually I am really do believe that classical architecture can offer an awful lot in terms of, it grows out of both societal principles and a proper balance with the natural world. So I think there's a huge amount to learn from it. I also think that all architects should know the basics of classical design, because I think that even if you're not going to design classical buildings, having an awareness of classical principles, the way that buildings and places are composed and built, can only be a good thing. And this is why I feel disappointed that so many universities, which should be places of learning, have kind of shut down classical architecture as a sort of no limits area.
I also think that classical architecture is really important because it's just been around for so long. There's a lot of meaning that's within classical architecture, and I think it's good to kind of continue that tradition. And if anyone knows anything about classical architecture, it's widely diverse in how it's kind of incorporated into a building. It's not the same old thing over and over again, which is what a lot of people think it is who don't understand it. And I get quite frustrated by that. There's so many different ways you can use classical architecture. You can use it in a vernacular sense. You can use it in a civic sense, quite grand and formal. You can use it in a very simplistic and economical way as well. So it's a very, very kind of useful architectural language to have as an architect.
I think it gives us more cultural richness than the alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think our time is up. We're 2 minutes over.
To wrap up, well, that's okay. No, I was just thinking this has really been like a chance to eavesdrop on just a really interesting conversation between the two of you, and helped as well by the great questions that have been coming through from participants. So as Juliet's just sent a message to all, so that you know that questions that didn't get answered because there wasn't time, we'll share those afterwards and perhaps seek to have some responses from George and from Diana that we can then send around to participants. So it's huge thanks to Diana and to George for speaking and for giving us all of that background on your roads to becoming a classical architect. I know we had the singular road on the event title, but it really is roads, and picturing that not, I guess, as a sort of suburban spaghetti junction of super highways, but more a kind of Poundbury plan of lanes and alleys sort of curving round as they do, but all reaching a central good public space. I'm going to, with huge thanks again to you, Diana, and to you, George, hand over to Jules now, just to give a very quick sum of how you can get more involved with INTBAU.
Thanks very much, Harriet, and a huge thanks to Diana and George. What a fascinating talk. You can see on the screen now I'm sharing our website. I presume most of you will be familiar with that. But it's really, really important, I think, in this time of extended lockdown for many of us, that we're aware that things are going on, and that you can get involved virtually no matter where you are in the world. INTBAU is an international network. So please come to our website. There is a membership that is completely free, and you can find it on our homepage. If you sign up to that, you'll get the newsletter, which goes out monthly with details of all the upcoming talks. And next week, we'll actually be launching our autumn series. So this is the last session of the summer series, and we're looking to continue finding equally great content that will be hard to match this session. I've really, really enjoyed it. So thanks again, and thanks all for joining. I'm gonna stop sharing now, and I wish you all a good evening.
Great. Thanks, George. Thanks, Diana.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.